I never thought the woman I loved for years would betray me so easily. But when the truth came out, it wasn't just my marriage that fell apart, it was my entire world. And what happened next? I never saw coming. Chrissy admitted that she had developed deep feelings for this man but dismissed it as nothing more than an act of compassion. This man, whose name she refused to disclose, had been in a devastating car accident that claimed the life of his wife, while he miraculously survived without a scratch. Overcome with guilt, he struggled to cope with the emotional aftermath. At first, Chrissy said she simply wanted to support him through his grief, to be there for him as a friend. But over time their bond deepened into something more. She acknowledged that they had crossed a line, that there was a physical connection between them, something undeniable. Frustrated, I asked her how she would feel if I started looking for another woman. Without hesitation, Chrissy shot back, her words laced with venom. "Who would even want you?" she sneered. "You're just a fat, middle-aged man with thinning hair." Then, with an icy glare, she warned me that if I ever tried to divorce her, she would make sure my life was ruined. I was shaking with anger, completely lost in a whirlwind of emotions. My mind was racing, unable to process everything rationally. I wanted to respond, to fight back, but before I could, she snapped, "Watch your mouth, Ron," as we pulled up to our destination. "This man is a good person," she added sharply. "Unlike you and your disgraceful behavior yesterday." I felt the sting of her words but forced myself to focus. "I wouldn't trust him with them," I muttered, referring to our kids. She rolled her eyes. "They weren't even home," she said, brushing past me and heading upstairs. I followed her into our bedroom, my voice tight with frustration. "So, are you staying here or are you running off to your lover?" She let out a sigh, as if I were the one being unreasonable. "Ron, stop being childish," she said. "I've already explained everything to you." Trying to push past the tension, I suggested taking the kids to their grandparents. To my relief, Chrissy agreed and the kids were thrilled with the idea. They loved spending time with their grandparents, especially their grandfather, Sam. He had been helping them build go-karts for months, and the project was nearing completion. Sam and his wife, Mary, lived on a small farm just 15 minutes from our house. Both retired, Sam especially loved working with his hands and enjoyed every moment he spent tinkering with projects alongside the kids. Our oldest, Jake, was 15, a smart, ambitious kid who had recently won a scholarship. His younger sister, Sally, at 14, was a typical teenager, constantly pushing boundaries but still managing to do well in school. And then there was Kyle, our youngest, just 11. Even though he hated being called the baby, Chrissy never stopped doing it. Kyle had been an unexpected blessing, coming into our lives when we thought we were done having kids. He was full of energy, always cheerful, always bringing joy wherever he went. While the kids excitedly packed their things for the trip, my mind was still stuck in a storm of emotions. I wasn't sure what to do next, but one thing was certain: I couldn't just ignore what had happened. She likely assumed that the decision would rest entirely on Gary's reputation, a man known for his ruthless nature. But Bev shocked everyone with her unwavering sense of justice. Wasting no time, she picked up her granddaughter from kindergarten and immediately took her to a doctor for a full examination to either confirm or refute the accusations of mistreatment. The doctor, after a thorough evaluation, firmly stated that the child had not been harmed in any way. With this reassurance, Bev wasted no time and went straight to the authorities. Meanwhile, I was scrambling for help. "I think I have his number somewhere," I muttered, sifting through the growing stack of business cards and notes we had accumulated. As my son's divorce proceedings grew increasingly complicated, we found ourselves relying on legal counsel more and more. One name in particular kept surfacing: Dwight Tucker. After a quick search, Bob found Mr. Tucker's business card, and I wasted no time dialing his office number. It was a Saturday and I wasn't expecting anyone to answer, but I decided to leave a message anyway. To my surprise, Mr. Tucker was actually in his office, and his secretary put me through to him immediately. Feeling a little flustered, I cleared my throat, embarrassed by how desperate I must have sounded. My face grew warm, but I simply nodded when Tucker encouraged me to continue. I took a deep breath and explained how Chrissy had become furious when I turned down her proposition. Hesitantly, I admitted that in the heat of the moment, I had resorted to name-calling. I couldn't help but remember how she had laughed in my face when I asked how she would feel if I pursued another woman. It was humiliating, one of the most painful moments of my life. Chrissy had made it clear that, in her eyes, I was worthless as a man, insisting that I would never find someone else. Tucker listened carefully before leaning forward with a serious expression. "I'll be honest with you," he said. "She can cause trouble if she wants to, But if it comes to that, you'll likely still be entitled to at least half of everything you own. Just keep in mind that courts don't take infidelity into account when it comes to asset division." His words made my stomach sink. "So that means I'll still have to pay alimony and spousal support?" I asked, feeling the weight of reality settle over me. "There's a possibility," Tucker admitted, glancing at his notes. "That's why we need to act quickly and strategically." I sat there in silence, overwhelmed by everything. When I finally lifted my head, I realized my cheeks were wet. Tears had begun to fall without me even realizing it. I gave him a small nod of appreciation before finally saying what had been weighing on me the most. "I still care about her," I confessed, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't excuse what she's done. She neglected our marriage. She broke the promises we made to each other. And now," I swallowed hard, "I feel like I'm on the verge of breaking. I want a divorce." Dwight nodded, flipped to a fresh page in his notebook and asked, "Can you give me an idea of what financial resources you have?" I hesitated for a moment, mentally going over our assets. By my calculations, we had about $35,000 sitting in a checking account. We also had several credit cards, but I had always used our joint account to pay them off. "Consider applying for a new credit card in your name only," Dwight suggested. "I do have one," I said. "It's a credit card I got before we were married, but I hardly use it since our joint account offers cashback rewards." "Then there's no need to open a new one," Dwight replied quickly, jotting down notes in his pad. After a moment, he tore out the page and handed it to me. "Here's what I need you to do. First, go to my secretary and have her contact Taylor Locksmith. Get the locks changed at your house as soon as possible." I took the paper and gave him a grateful nod. "Before you go," Dwight continued, "handle your banking matters. I'll take care of filing an urgent restraining order against your wife. This will legally prohibit her from entering your home or coming within 500 feet of you or the kids." I swallowed hard, still trying to process everything. "She's currently living with her lover," he added, his voice firm. "And we know that she left your children with him. This is important information. It will strengthen your case when we move forward with filing an injunction." My chest tightened at his words. Chrissy had left our kids with a man I knew nothing about, someone she had met under questionable circumstances. The thought made my blood boil. "By Friday I'll have the divorce papers ready to serve her," Dwight assured me. I nodded and stood up, feeling the weight of reality press down on me. Later that evening, I pulled into my in-laws' driveway. As I turned off the engine, I spotted Sam emerging from his workshop. He waved before disappearing around the side of the house. The kids wasted no time jumping out of the car and running inside to greet their grandfather. Mary, my mother-in-law, met me at the door with a warm smile and kissed me on the cheek. Not long after, Sam joined us, freshly washed up from his work. I hesitated, feeling a tight knot form in my stomach. "I'm sorry," I finally said, my voice lower than I intended. "But there's something I need to tell you." I took a deep breath, but my voice still trembled as I spoke. "Chrissy is having an affair," I admitted, my words barely above a whisper. "And I've decided to file for divorce." Sam's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. He stared at me as if hoping he had misheard. "Chrissy, is this true?" he finally asked. A tense silence filled the room before Chrissy spoke. Her tone was uneasy. "What exactly did Ron say?" she asked cautiously. Sam's jaw tightened. "He told me you're in a romantic relationship with another man." Chrissy let out a shaky breath. "It's complicated, Daddy," she insisted. "I was just trying to help him through a difficult time." Sam's face reddened with anger and his hands clenched into fists. "That's not what I asked you," he said, his voice strained with frustration. "Are you or are you not involved with him?" She hesitated before answering. "We were close," she admitted. "But my feelings—" "Enough," Sam interrupted, shaking his head. "You made your choice, Chrissy. And now you have to live with it." Turning to me, he placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Ron, you and the kids are always welcome here," he said firmly. "I'll talk to my daughter later and let you know how it goes, but right now, I'm too upset to speak with her any further." I nodded in appreciation. It was clear that even Sam, a father who had always defended his daughter, was deeply disappointed in her actions. After getting the kids settled in the car, I said my goodbyes to Sam and Mary, inviting them to dinner so we could discuss everything further. But before I even pulled out of the driveway, Sally, my 14-year-old, burst into tears. "Are you and Mom getting a divorce?" she asked through sobs. Her question sent a pang through my chest. "Where did you hear that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Tom," she said, pointing at her older brother. Tom, my 15-year-old, looked up with guilt in his eyes. I overheard you and Grandpa talking, he admitted. I sighed, gripping the steering wheel tightly. This wasn't how I wanted them to find out, but there was no sense in denying it now. We'll talk more at home, I said, trying to offer some comfort. Later that evening, I confronted Chrissy once more. You weren't just trying to help him, I said, my voice filled with a mix of hurt and anger. You betrayed me and you threatened to ruin me, all while claiming that you love me. I shook my head in disbelief. People who truly love each other don't behave like this. Chrissy looked stunned by my words. I'm really sorry, she whispered, her expression shifting from defiance to guilt. I didn't mean to hurt you. I exhaled sharply. Then maybe you should think about your actions before you make choices that destroy everything around you. Chrissy bit her lip, struggling for words. Ron. Listen, she finally said, slipping into that soft, condescending tone she usually reserved for talking to the kids. Stop being silly. I'm your wife. You know me. I love you. I waited, hoping for some shred of honesty. But then she said the one thing that shattered whatever hope I had left. I will come back to you as soon as he gets better. A wave of disappointment crashed over me, heavier than anything I had felt before. I had reached my limit. Whatever love I had left for her, it wasn't enough anymore. The love I once had for Chrissy had completely dissolved, replaced by something colder, something bitter, hatred. I'm sorry, Chrissy, I said, my voice devoid of warmth. But I don't know who you are anymore. She stared at me, but I didn't wait for a response. Instead, I turned away and stepped onto the porch, shaking my head in disappointment. It was clear she didn't fully grasp the weight of her actions, nor did she seem to care about the consequences she might soon face. She acted as if she could do whatever she wanted, without fear of losing everything. As I stood there, lost in thought, I heard the sound of tires crunching against the gravel. A sheriff's car pulled up and a deputy stepped out, making his way toward Chrissy. Are you Chrissy Jameson? The deputy asked. Chrissy's brow furrowed in confusion. Yes, I am, she replied hesitantly. Ma'am, this is a restraining order, the deputy stated firmly, handing her the paperwork. Chrissy's face twisted in shock as she scanned the document, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for words. I didn't stick around to hear whatever excuse she was about to make. Instead, I turned toward the backyard where the kids were playing and knelt down to talk to them. Your mom is going to stay somewhere else for a while, I told them carefully, choosing my words with caution. But you'll have a chance to say goodbye before she leaves. The moment we stepped out into the front yard, Kyle, our youngest, broke down. Tears streamed down his face as he ran into his mother's arms, clinging to her desperately. Sally, on the other hand, was furious. She stood stiffly, her hands clenched into fists. When she finally spoke, her voice was sharp and filled with anger. You're selfish and heartless, she snapped at Chrissy. Before the situation could escalate further, I quickly stepped in, gently holding Sally back. That's enough, I said firmly. I understand that you're upset, but we're not going to handle this with anger. I won't apologize. Sally shot back, her voice trembling with rage. Chrissy seemed caught off guard by her daughter's hostility. She took a shaky step backward, her composure finally breaking as she collapsed onto the porch, sobbing. I wasn't surprised by Sally's reaction. Over the past few months, tensions between her and Chrissy had been growing, their disagreements becoming more frequent. Deep down, I think Sally had sensed this moment coming long before the rest of us. Later that evening, I sat with Sam, who looked more worn down than I'd ever seen him. She's staying at her lover's house, I told him quietly. Sam exhaled heavily, rubbing his face. That only makes this harder to accept, he admitted, his voice filled with sorrow. Mary, his wife, had spoken to Chrissy after I left, hoping to reason with her. And how did it go? I asked, though I wasn't expecting much. Sam shook his head. It's terrible, he admitted. Mary tried, but Chrissy still thinks she's the victim. She refuses to see how much damage she's caused. Mary, who had been sitting silently, suddenly slammed her hand against the table. She called us terrible people, she said, her voice filled with anger. I have never seen her so stubborn, so unwilling to accept responsibility. The conversation ended on a heavy note. I had no choice but to set a firm boundary. If she refuses to take responsibility, I said, then from now on, I don't want her to contact any of us. And with that, I made peace with the fact that my marriage was well and truly over. Even when the restraining order was discussed, the judge showed little sympathy. His only concern was that the children were safe. Ultimately, he agreed to modify the order. Chrissy would be allowed to visit the house, but only under supervision. However, her lover was strictly prohibited from coming within 500 feet of the property. The judge made it clear that if she violated this rule, she would lose her visitation rights entirely. Chrissy seemed thrilled with these changes. Personally, I didn't mind. I wanted the kids to have a relationship with their mother. But her excitement over the situation left a bad taste in my mouth. It was as if she had won something, rather than understanding the damage she had caused. For a brief moment, I considered the possibility of trying to rebuild our home life for the sake of the kids. But as I reflected on everything that had happened, I knew that staying together wouldn't set the right example for them. Instead, I made a different choice. I decided to use up all my vacation days and personal leave so I could stay home with them for as long as possible. When my time off eventually ran out, Sam and Mary stepped in to help look after the children. Though they adored their grandkids, their relationship with Chrissy had completely deteriorated. Sam confided in me one evening that Chrissy had been calling repeatedly, several times a day for a full week. At first he had answered, but the conversations always ended in frustration. Eventually he had enough. Without another word he blocked her number. One afternoon Chrissy showed up outside the house, but she wasn't alone. Her lover was sitting in the car at the end of the driveway. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. "Tell that guy to leave and I won't report this to the judge," I said firmly. Chrissy nodded quickly and hurried back to the car. As she leaned in through the passenger side window, an idea crossed my mind. Moving discreetly, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a pen. While she was distracted talking to him, I carefully jotted down his license plate number. Once the car drove off, I calmly returned to the porch, watching as Chrissy walked back toward the house. "He said he'll pick me up later," she said. "Tell him to meet you down the street," I replied coldly. "I don't want him anywhere near this house." Before Chrissy could say anything else, Mary stepped in, her expression stern. "One mistake, Chrissy," she warned, "and you won't be welcome here anymore." Chrissy remained silent and simply nodded before stepping inside. Once she was gone, Mary turned to me, placing a gentle hand on my arm. "Ron, I'm really sorry for how my daughter has acted," she said sincerely. "I just wanted to thank you for standing your ground." I let out a heavy breath, nodding in appreciation. "I just want to do what's best for the kids," I said. And with that, I silently hoped that one day, Chrissy would come to understand the true weight of the choices she had made. I nodded gratefully. 2 weeks after the initial hearing, just as Dwight had predicted, the restraining order was lifted. By then, I had established myself as the primary caregiver for the children, which allowed me to remain in the house while Chrissy continued seeing her lover. Meanwhile, the court ruled that she had an obligation to pay alimony. Chrissy, of course, had plenty to say about that. During one of our mandated therapy sessions, she tried to justify her actions, her tone laced with arrogance. But the following week, the therapist took a different approach. She gently challenged Chrissy's reasoning, presenting her with a hypothetical scenario. What if I had been the one to enter into an intimate relationship with another woman? I braced myself, expecting another attack on my masculinity, but for once it didn't come. Chrissy hesitated, as if struggling to find an answer. But at that point her words had lost all meaning to me. The long divorce process had changed me. In many ways I had been forced to rebuild myself from the ground up. That might sound arrogant, but it was the truth. I started going to the gym regularly, pushing myself to get stronger both physically and mentally. I also took a hard look at our family's eating habits. Fast food, cookies, ice cream, and frozen pizzas had been regular staples in our house, but I decided it was time for a change. At first, the kids weren't thrilled about the healthier meals, but I spent time researching fun, nutritious recipes that we could all enjoy. It became a little adventure, trying new dishes, laughing at my failed experiments, and celebrating the ones that turned out surprisingly good. Not everything worked out perfectly, but we made the best of it. If something tasted awful, we just laughed, tossed it out, and tried again. One day at work, I was having a conversation with Trudy, a longtime colleague. She had heard about my situation, though I had tried to keep things private. Apparently, word had spread, and now it seemed like everyone in the office knew. Trudy listened attentively, concern evident on her face. "Ron, I don't think Chrissy understands anything, or maybe she's just not right in the head," she said, shaking her head. "But listen to me, you're a wonderful person, and there are plenty of women out there who would be lucky to have you. Don't let Chrissy's words get to you." Hearing that was like a long overdue boost to my confidence. It was the best reassurance I'd received in months. For the first time in a long time, I believed it. For the first time in a long while, I felt like a winner again. The therapy sessions with Chrissy, however, were proving to be a waste of time. The therapist tried repeatedly to make her see the absurdity of her reasoning, but Chrissy remained stubborn. It became painfully clear that she wasn't there for healing or self-reflection. She was only using the sessions to justify her choices. I had long since given up hope that she would ever admit she was wrong. The initial shock of her betrayal had started to wear off, and a realization settled in: love, if not nurtured, begins to fade. And that's exactly what was happening. By the third week, something had changed in her. She spoke less and listened more. Her usual arrogance had dulled, replaced by something else. Maybe regret, maybe resignation. Whatever it was, I didn't care anymore. My focus had shifted to something far more important: my future. I needed to rebuild my life, and I needed to start somewhere. Fortunately, Sam stepped in with an offer. His farm had an industrial workshop that he had originally built as a shed but later converted into a fully equipped workspace. It was spacious, and best of all, he agreed to lease me a piece of land near the road if my business ever took off. While researching the local automotive industry, I visited a dealership and realized that they had everything needed to handle a much larger volume of repairs than I had initially assumed. This got me thinking. There was a demand for bodywork and repairs, and I had the skills to fill that gap. Before long, word got around that I was taking on repair work. Someone from the dealership even approached me with an offer to collaborate on certain jobs. Unfortunately, I had to turn it down because I had already built a base of my own clients. However, running my own business came with a difficult reality: I couldn't keep my full-time job much longer. When I finally told my boss, Bob, that I needed to step away due to my growing business commitments, I knew it wouldn't go over well. "Got a minute, Bob?" I asked, standing in his office doorway. "Of course, Ron," he said, waving me in. "Glad you're working this weekend. We've got 44 cars arriving on Friday, and they all need to be inspected and shipped by the end of the month." My stomach dropped a little. That was a massive workload. Many people didn't realize the special incentives that factories and dealerships operated under, but I knew exactly how much pressure was on Bob to get everything done on time. Still, I had to be honest. "I wanted to let you know that I've started my own business," I told him. "I've set up shop on my father-in-law's property, and I have all the necessary equipment to take on a full range of auto repair jobs, including bodywork." Bob leaned back in his chair, considering my words. Then he reached for the phone. "Go grab a cup of coffee and come back in a few minutes," he said. I didn't bother. Instead, I walked to my locker, packed my things into a box, and closed the door behind me. Losing this job meant fewer opportunities in the immediate future, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I was ready to bet on myself. I removed the children from my health insurance plan, ensuring they were fully covered under my new business policy instead. With my schedule becoming more flexible, I had more time to focus on growing my company. Sam started helping part-time, and Mary stepped in to handle the bookkeeping. Thanks to their support, I was now making more money than I ever had at the dealership. The only part of my life that remained unresolved was my marriage. By the time we reached the 4th counseling session, I seriously considered walking away from it altogether. I had reached a point where I no longer cared about Chrissy's relationship with her new partner. That wasn't to say it didn't sting. Knowing she was with someone else still hurt, but it no longer consumed me the way it once had. At the end of the session, the therapist assigned us homework, something I had no interest in completing. I was already convinced that these sessions were a waste of time. The assignment consisted of a list of questions. Some of them reasonable, like ones about our childhood and how our parents' relationships influenced us. But others felt completely irrelevant, like questions about our favorite foods, drinks, or even what kind of car we drove. I went through the motions, but my mind was elsewhere. During one session, the therapist encouraged us to address unresolved feelings, including my thoughts on Chrissy's new partner. "Do you have any desire to confront him?" she asked. I shook my head. "I know where he comes from, but to be honest, I have no interest in seeking revenge or even speaking to him. I've reached a point where I just don't care anymore. I have no emotional investment left in this situation. I'm only focused on moving forward." For the first time in a long while, Chrissy looked at me with deep sadness. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, like she wanted to say more. For a brief moment, I felt a strong urge to comfort her. But I knew better. A simple hug wouldn't fix the damage that had been done. Instead, I kept my voice calm and firm. "I know your lawyer wasn't happy with my initial settlement proposal," I said. "So I've instructed my lawyer to explore other options. My priority is making sure you have a fair chance to rebuild your relationship with the kids." Chrissy's eyes welled up with tears, and within seconds she hurried out of the room, unable to hold back her emotions any longer. When she returned later, I was taken aback by how exhausted she looked. After taking a few deep breaths to compose herself, she finally spoke. I want to continue counseling, she said hesitantly, but I think we should start having separate sessions. I sighed, reluctant but unwilling to argue. Fine, I agreed. At first, every time Chrissy talked about her struggles, I felt nothing but rage. But as time passed, the anger faded, not because I forgave her but because I simply ran out of energy to keep feeling anything at all. I had suffered deeply from this situation, but over time I began to see things with more clarity. I remembered how, at one point, I had desperately wanted to be a better husband, hoping that Chrissy would never stop loving me. But love, I realized, wasn't always enough. During one counseling session, the therapist reflected on something I had said in the past. "Ron," she began gently, "your wife never stopped loving you." I let out a bitter laugh. "And yet she still slept with Bruce," I muttered. The therapist gave me a disapproving look but sighed in understanding. Meanwhile, Chrissy sat silently, her eyes brimming with tears. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaky. She admitted that she had been struggling with a severe midlife crisis, something that had clouded her judgment and led her to make choices she now regretted. It didn't change anything for me. What mattered most now was our children. Since the beginning of this entire mess, Sally's grades had suffered noticeably. She was still holding on to a deep resentment toward her mother, and it was affecting her in ways I couldn't ignore. Kyle, my youngest, had changed the most. Once full of laughter, he had become withdrawn and distant. He had even started acting out in school, displaying destructive behavior that was completely out of character for him. Of all the consequences of Chrissy's actions, this was the one that cut the deepest. She hadn't just hurt me, she had taken away Kyle's light. Tom, on the other hand, seemed to be handling things better than his siblings. He remained calm and composed, never showing any signs of resentment or frustration. If anything, he had taken on the role of the steady rock in our little family, quietly supporting his brother and sister in his own way. Then one day I uncovered something shocking. The story Chrissy's lover had told her wasn't entirely true. Yes, he had lost his wife in a car accident, but the real reason she had been driving that night was because she had just discovered his infidelity. Furious and heartbroken, she had sped off, losing control of the vehicle. As if that wasn't bad enough, after her death, he had been attacked outside a local bar, beaten badly by people who knew what had happened. Eventually, he left town, trying to escape the consequences of his actions. I had to make sure he wouldn't cause any more harm. With the help of a few trusted friends, I ensured that he wouldn't be able to manipulate or hurt another woman again. Meanwhile, Chrissy had slowly managed to rebuild some form of connection with our children. They had begun to accept the reality of our separation, and though it had taken time, they were adjusting. As for me, I had moved on. I had found love again, and the way it happened felt like something out of another lifetime. The journey that led me to my new relationship was something I never could have predicted, but the most important thing was that the kids embraced it. They saw the happiness in my life, and for them that was enough. Chrissy, on the other hand, struggled to accept it. But I chose not to waste any energy on her feelings. She had two choices: accept the situation or don't. Either way, I wasn't going to change my life for her. She had begun pursuing relationships with men younger than her, seemingly desperate to find the validation she had once sought elsewhere. But from what I had heard, it hadn't gone well. Her attempts to find happiness in fleeting intimacy were leading nowhere. And while she continued searching, I had finally found peace.